Everything and anything that has ever existed, is existing, or will ever exist is utterly meaningless. All things within the observable universe, including itself, will come to an inevitable end, as this is death, and death is the sole certainty in all that exists. This is perhaps the most fundamental way of perceiving Deathconsciousness. This album, released under a month after New Year's Day of 2008 to very little traction, created by a duo with a sparse and largely unknown background prior to their debut, speaks profoundly of death and the inescapable dread it brings to living, knowing that there is no genuine significance to anything at all. Deathconsciousness's themes of nihilism, the philosophical belief that there is no objective value in anything that exists, are centered around humanity's own relationship with death, and explores how its presence all throughout the course of time has shaped the lives of all individuals in ways more noticeable now than the entirety of its 16-year existence. Frankly speaking, there is no project quite like Deathconsciousness. Of course, this is true sonically. It's essentially a blend of the industrial brutality of Nine Inch Nails, the damning songwriting of Swans, the gloomy post-punk strains of the Sisters of Mercy, and the bleak shoegaze instrumentation of early Slowdive or My Bloody Valentine. But there's so much more to it than just that. Have a Nice Life establishes an atmosphere that is depressive, numbing, and draining to live in, much like that of the trials and tribulations we often face in the real world. From the moment the record begins, the listener is fully immersed in a state of devastation, encapsulating the very same feeling one can imagine experiencing as they helplessly watch the world before them crumble and burn, left with nothing more than their own final thoughts to dwell upon as unforgiving flames slowly consume them as well. There is not a single ounce of happiness in this entire 1 hour and 30-minute record, but what is there to be happy about when all lives are wasted, when any attempts at finding some sort of purpose end in vain, when death surrounds us everywhere, whether we notice this or not? Through heavy distortion, towering walls of dark ambience, and emotional storytelling both within and outside of the music, Deathconsciousness displays existential dread in a way that will rip apart your soul and strip you of any last bit of hope that you so desperately cling on to. The album serves as an embodiment of depression musically, a lesson on transcendental nihilism in the form of equally tragic stories narratively, and when all put together, well, it makes for a fucking masterpiece. Have a Nice Life is Dan Barrett and Tim Makuga. Dan, a family man with an established background in real estate, and Tim, a beloved, albeit reclusive, high school history teacher. Have a Nice Life came to be when two musicians realized that they were more or less the same person, sharing similarities in their perceptions of the universe around them. In a series of past interviews, Dan and Tim recount first meeting as young college students navigating their way through the world, both being aspiring musicians who frequented local punk rock shows as performers with their respective collectives. Before uniting as one, Dan had initially been a member of a post-hardcore band known as In Pieces, and Tim was part of a small yet chaotic punk band called The Danger Strangers, though they had little material to show for and were ultimately short-lived. Their groups may have dissolved not long after their formation, but Dan and Tim still had an ambition to create absurd and audacious music for any audience willing to take in whatever came of their sporadic imagination, and that was a spark that never went out. The music would have to wait though, as Dan had later moved from New England to Japan for overseas studies and lived in the nation for roughly a year. Still though, Dan and Tim made prior plans to pick back up where they last left off and form their first ever band as a newfound duo. They threw some name ideas around, Junkyard Wars being the initial proposal for the band name, but after more thinking, they went with the sarcastically sounding Have a Nice Life, and as Dan himself put it, they meant it to the listeners in the meanest way possible. Of course, as the duo were separated, they still largely stayed in touch and kept the musical discourse alive between them, sharing acoustic recordings and giving back and forth feedback on whatever ideas they had in mind. Email was what led to the formulation of Have a Nice Life. This constant conversation that saw two creative minds collaborating with each other to find the right sound that was boundary pushing, genre bending, and challenged the listener through morbid experimentation, unlike that of what either had previously done during their young careers. Having been influenced by the often gloomy and frigid atmosphere of New England, as well as the works of 20th century filmmakers such as Akira Kurosawa and Ingmar Bergman, Have a Nice Life were desolate in sound, with rather despairing songwriting that made them distinct amongst the modest following that they had. When Dan returned to Connecticut, the duo began performing at small open mic events at coffee shops and hardcore shows in dorm basements, playing whatever acoustic recordings they had finished during the band's earliest stages. We didn't have the most fully thought out intentions, maybe to push the dashboard confessional sincerity thing, which was at its peak, into absurd, grotesque territory. I remember some guy on an internet message board asked, "Wait, is this supposed to be comedy?" We didn't know. Eventually, we figured out the rudiments of home recording and started to explore absurdity and ugliness more soberly, with sounds that matched our imaginations rather than the social convenience of a quick performance. Have a Nice Life were very much isolated from the surrounding underground rock scenes in the New England region, opting against commercializing themselves to appeal to wider audiences, which other bands of their size had attempted at during this time. Word of their shows was slowly spreading, but generally, Have a Nice Life never received much attention during their humble beginnings, whether some didn't understand their vision or simply weren't sold by the accompanying music. Much of their demos hadn't even been recorded during this time as well, which remained the case up until the passing of Dan's father. It was then when the duo took to the studio and utilized their limited budget to finally release these songs in the flesh, implementing even more darkness in their music and shrouding their vocals with overwhelming distortion and layers of hard-hitting instrumentation. After some more time though, the band began the recording process of their debut record, Deathconsciousness, which would see them spend 5 years writing, redoing, and overcoming a number of infuriating hardships, whether they were musical, financial, or rooted in everlasting battles with depression and the obstacles of life itself. The band initially put out 2 demo tapes in the years before Deathconsciousness titled Have a Nice Life vs. You and Powers of 10. As was Deathconsciousness, both tapes were self-distributed under Dan's own music label, Enemies List Home Recordings, and feature collections of early demo recordings that evolved over time to become the finalized, fleshed-out works that made up their debut album. Dan has spoken about the songwriting process of Deathconsciousness in an interview with Scene Point Blank, elaborating on the depressive environment he was surrounded by that had a significant influence on his work ethic. The lyrics were written simultaneously with the songs, though I tend to work in scraps. I'm constantly writing, then culling pieces that I think fit the music to build entire songs around. At the time, I had a job where I would have to be in work at 4:30 in the morning, alone in a giant building, at a desk in front of a giant window. I wrote reams and reams during that time. A pivotal dilemma came when Have a Nice Life had actually lost the original master files for Deathconsciousness. As opposed to being WAV files, an unforeseen hard drive crash forced the band to convert the audio recordings into 128 kilobytes per second MP3 files, a detrimental blow to the sound quality of the overall project. A setback such as this would leave almost any other outfit no other choice but to start from scratch yet again, let alone one with a minuscule following working on their debut release. Yet, one could argue that the undeveloped final masters and rawness of the recordings may have only strengthened the listening experience in ways that couldn't have been replicated. The faulty files indirectly added onto the feeling of realness that went along with Deathconsciousness and its themes, something that die-hard fans took notice of and eventually gravitated towards. From the very beginning, Dan and Tim were merely 2 everymen, and they never tried to be anything more than that. What Have a Nice Life had was a vision to create a soul-crushing masterwork of an album, and their undying ambition was all that they needed in utilizing what little tools they were surrounded by to create music with deeply personal sentiments. Mostly recording on a pinhole laptop mic in an amateur home studio while completely self-financed. The goal for Dan and Tim was never to make the most appealing album, but to make the album they'd be happy with if they were the last 2 people on Earth, assuming no one except them would ever hear their work. Of course, Dan was still heavily mourning the loss of his father during the making of this record, and as morose as this passing made him, it simultaneously enlightened him on the concept of death as a whole. our world still goes on after we lose the most beloved people in our lives. And the grim reality of it all is that this utterly tragic event that is death is happening at every moment, at every place. And we choose to be blind to this, despite how apparent death has been all throughout history. Have a Nice Life continued to thoroughly examine the aspects of death in their music, as well as a newly established idea in transcendental nihilism, defined as a form of existential angst where one holds the belief that every existing being is already dead. Dan himself took inspiration from his battles with grief and depression for the concept of deathconsciousness, as his inner psyche was so focused on death in an absurdist context that this total hyperfixation saw itself translating into the album's writing, soundscape, and visual artwork. Have a Nice Life's own experiences with dark times, combined with profound research on anthropological studies and an obsession with grotesque neoclassical artwork, culminated into a sophisticated, immensely detailed body of work. A project of dismaying art that included a double-disc collection of 13 songs and an accompanying fictional booklet which illustrates the history of a long-forgotten death cult, led by an English philosopher during the era of the Middle Ages. His name was Antiochus, his religion being Antiocheanism, and the detailed stories of death and despair within this history, as well as the teachings of Antiochus that eventually sealed his fate as an unspoken martyr, are intertwined with the terror and dread of deathconsciousness. Both sources speak of a hopelessness unbound to time, and both sources unapologetically remind us of the omnipresence of negation in all parts of life. Divided into 7 individual parts over a span of 70 pages, the Deathconsciousness booklet was included alongside the project's vinyl release in 2008 and is said to have been ghostwritten by a professor of religious anthropology and history at the University of Massachusetts, his identity remaining anonymous. Parts 5 through 7 contain official song lyrics, CD information, and medieval artwork accompanying the album, but the vast majority of the zine consists of an extensive essay that chronicles the obscure history of Antiocheanism, a religion spawning from the prophecies of an Italian religious figure in the 13th century only known as Antiochus. Any information on Antiochus is merely available in fragments, as there is a significant lack of complete text, historical data, or secondary sources surrounding his life. Many religious scholars of today still dispute whether or not Antiochus even existed, solely due to the enigmatic nature of his very limited record. Still, Dan and Tim felt as if his teachings perfectly mirrored the messages being conveyed on Deathconsciousness, and this led the duo to ask of an immense favor from a history professor. This being to author a manifesto that would introduce Antiochian history to their listeners and further enhance the project's listening experience through a written piece discussing its same themes. With what little information there was to include, undertaking this project proved frustrating, but thanks to the professor's profound efforts, the listener is able to observe Antiochus' journey of becoming a martyr, as well as gain an impression on his foreboding philosophy surrounding death, with a select amount of details compiled into an academic pamphlet. Explaining his reason for contributing, the anonymous professor writes, "If it were you that had disappeared, unknown, into history, you would want someone to try and remember you. You would want someone to try and understand. And as present-day followers, we will do just that." The pamphlet reiterates the general uncertainty of Antiocheanism in its introduction. It is unknown where their leader Antiochus was born, and ultimately unverified if he was even a real being. Some scholars believe that Antiochus may have been more of a metaphorical character than a historical figure, a symbolic vessel for a larger message. But fragmented scriptures from the books of terror and longing, a pivotal literal source for Antiochus' existence, points to him truly being a mortal man from the Middle Ages, albeit rarely, if not never mentioned in history books around the world. Though little is known of Antiochus' youth, records show that he was present in Rome, Italy as early as in 1215. One particular tale follows a 10-year-old Antiochus having a disconcerting encounter with a murder of crows. The birds were able to supernaturally communicate with the young boy and revealed to him that 15 local townspeople would soon collectively jump off a cliff and fall to their deaths. Having received this grisly news, Antiochus returned to his village and foretold the impending deaths to as many people as he could. The villagers were terrified of what the 10-year-old boy had so confidently stated, and later formed a search party within the town to senselessly murder as many crows as they could find, believing the birds to be an omen of death who brought an evil energy upon the village. Their visions were clouded by strong hatred towards the crows, and their minds shrouded in fear of death. Eventually, the search party stumbled upon a considerably large group of crows, the most they had seen up until this point. The townspeople charged at the birds with knives, torches, and nails at hand, not thinking twice of their intentions to kill. Little did they know, the villagers were atop the steepest cliff in the area, and when the crows suddenly evaporated into thin air, all that was in front of them now was the cold, dark abyss that was death. That night, on the Via Private, a Latin term which aptly describes self-directed death, Antiochus' first of many prophecies had been fulfilled. As straightforward as this event was, the deaths of the 15 villagers harrowingly foreshadows the philosophy that Antiochus would sacrifice his life teaching that much like the villagers, we are all walking corpses running obliviously towards our own demise. Antiochus spent his teenage years in the illustrious city of Rome, leaving behind the simple town his parents inhabited and residing in what was then the center of the world. Living in the city was an overwhelming experience for Antiochus, as he seemed to have been magnetically drawn to its booming economy and ever-increasing weight of the human presence surrounding him. Though simultaneously, Antiochus sensed from the start that Rome was already a dead civilization. The awing architecture and flourishing society masked the city's faults and made future catastrophes entirely unforeseen to its population. But not to Antiochus, who could see death in every street corner, and is perhaps why he felt so gravitated towards Rome for his whole life. Ultimately, Antiochus was exiled from Rome nearly 5 years following his arrival due to an affair he had with the wife of a Roman senator named Joanna of the Orsini, who had eerily slashed her throat not long after meeting him. The relationship, and especially Joanne's death, tarnished Antiochus' local reputation and forced him into hiding for over 25 years. Infamously known among scholars as the Lost Years, documentation on Antiochus in his exile is all but non-existent. What is known is that Antiochus spent much of his time living in the Caucasus within a community of ethnic Armenians, but again, where exactly his settlement was located is unknown. Regardless, Antiochus was said to have undergone a significant amount of religious training during this time, developing a belief system that, while was incredibly unorthodox, gave him profound confidence and altered his personality in ways that made him unrecognizable in his return to Rome. The man was now charged with charisma in a way that made townspeople believe that he had finally discovered the one true faith in the universe. Amongst morbid folk tales, some thought that a severely traumatic event was what led to Antiochus changing so drastically, though he himself has never mentioned anything of such. When a Roman poet brought up this theory with him, Antiochus simply replied by stating, "The only tragedy is life, and that is more than enough." Antiochus returned to Rome in 1250, exactly 27 years after originally being exiled, and during a brief time of peace in the medieval world. All was quiet in the years prior to Antiochus' arrival, but some theorize that it was this very reason that he chose this exact moment to make his return, his newfound philosophy finally ready for dissemination to a world blind to future apocalypses. Antiochus' changes in his psyche translated to his physical appearance as well. He was now tall and buff, no longer a young boy with sinewy muscles, with a beard stretched over his face and down his chest, while wearing a black and gray robe and satchel on his person. After entering the city, Antiochus went to the streets of Rome to begin teaching his message. The man was calculated and cogent with his methods. He did not obnoxiously yell out his beliefs like a madman, but instead spoke individually to passerbys, pulling them aside and sharing his philosophy with them one-on-one. Antiochus firmly stated to all of them that he only chose from a select number of people that God himself told him to. that his decisions were far from random. God only brought upon Antiochus those who would heed his every word and genuinely accept his message for what it was, and his faith in the divine proved rewarding in broadening the reach of Antiocheanism. With a poised stature and articulate approach, Antiochus ended his first night in Rome with up to 15 devoted followers. Noted for his emotional style of preaching and unorthodox beliefs, Antiochus' success rate in spreading Antiocheanism grew increasingly higher, which caught the attention of civilians and local authorities alike. An excerpt from the Books of Terror and Logging speaks of an encounter Antiochus had with a young boy after 2 weeks of teaching in Rome. Unlike most, the boy approached Antiochus as a skeptic of his teachings, believing that he had all but avoided the question, the truth that everyone has longed to hear from him, this simply being, what happens when we die? The crowd around Antiochus believed the boy to be ignorant, but while most viewed him with unease, Antiochus nonchalantly responded to the boy's skepticism, speaking in a voice that resembled a cold breeze and silenced the commotion around them. His answer came in a great monologue, but left no detail unincluded. There have been many that have said that death is like a deep sleep, but it is not peaceful and it is not restful. And the ones that have told you this seek only to make themselves feel better about what life is. But I do not care for your feelings, because your feelings are meaningless, completely and utterly meaningless, weightless. In grief, we do not claw our chests, we do not tear our clothes, we do not gnash our teeth, for though it lasts as long as it possibly can, God, the great pitier, is not present to keep the tally or to write your name. There is no death because there is no life. This is the question, and this is the answer. We are all trapped together, with no order, just a pile of limbs and faces and legs and fingers. And you may cry out, please, please, please release me. Please let me breathe. Please let me stand. But there will never be any reply, as there was never any cry to reply to. Once you have the answer, your life is over, because you sought truth, and now you have it. Death is truth, and truth is death. Antiocheanism continued to rise in popularity, but controversy came when a woman named Marisa Giovan ended her life in front of a crowd after receiving a one-on-one lecture from Antiochus, grabbing a knife from his hands and stabbing herself after having been enlightened of death's inescapable presence. Antiochus was then taken into custody, where he was beaten, tortured, and starved by authorities for a month. Antiochians testified that their leader was innocent, given that he himself had never put the blade to Giovan's neck, while her family actively sought for retribution against Antiochus despite a general lack of evidence. In the midst of all of this though, the leader himself stayed silent, simply taking his beatings and slander with nothing more than a dry smile. In what became the years of lead and ash, Antiochians were persecuted and oppressed by Roman authorities, largely due to mass hysteria resulting from a series of high-born murders, said to have been curated entirely by Antiochus and his followers as a revenge plot for his imprisonment. As a result of such vile allegations, Antiochians were tortured and killed in the most gruesome of ways, all while Antiochus himself was nowhere to be found in the midst of all of this death, as he had disappeared once again following his release from jail, but the damage had already been done. Ever since Giovan's death, Antiochus was viewed by locals and authorities as a murderer, Antiocheanism as a death cult, and any and all of his followers as bogeymen with no place in their society. Antiochus finally re-emerged from hiding in the year 1254, exactly 4 years after his second return to Rome, Italy. He was once again apprehended by Roman centurions for his alleged crimes, and ultimately burned at the stake. Following his death, Antiochus became so ill-conceived that he was unspoken of amongst the Roman people. His last remaining followers would suffer for decades to come, until each and every one of them had been killed off or exiled to various corners of the world, where attempts were made to revive Antiocheanism with what little resources were left available. They were considerable, but largely futile. With future generations being hardly interested in anything to do with Antiocheanism, Antiochus and his teachings faded into obscurity for centuries, with all Antiochian traditions, texts, and philosophies having been long neglected and subsequently discarded. That was, until a man named William Shelley, a 19th century historical scholar who resided in London, England, had developed a newfound interest in Antiocheanism and aimed to revive the otherwise dead religion. Shelley was the one responsible for providing all known information on Antiochus in the present day, essentially dedicating his life to exhaustively studying every aspect of Antiocheanism. If it wasn't for his contributions, this booklet would cease to exist. Shelley was raised in a well-off family, and his parents strongly encouraged him to live a future as part of the priesthood. But their hopes meant little to Shelley, who, while still having a keen interest in religion, chose to become more of a scholar instead. Writing in one of his many diary entries, "My parents saw in me more than I am. They saw in me a saint, but I am only a sinner. They saw in me a priest, but I am only a scholar." Shelley attended a series of religious schools during his youth, but found his experiences in all of them to be suffocating, their rigid environments conflicting with Shelley's individualistic nature. At 18 years old, Shelley would stun his parents by dropping out of school altogether. This decision would severely strain Shelley's relationship with his family, and with his father disowning Shelley for his actions and his mother passing away not long after, he had now been entirely isolated from his familial world. Though Shelley was now irrevocably orphaned, he chose to spend his time further pursuing his intellectual desires. A bright and inquisitive mind, Shelley buried himself in books, wrote for days on end, and eventually graduated from Oxford University. Shelley continued to study religious anthropology following his graduation, and at age 35, he made the sudden decision to journey to the Caucasus. Shelley was driven by a curiosity surrounding the then extremely obscure religion of Antiocheanism, intrigued by Antiochus's ghastly life, and wishing to indulge in his world firsthand instead of only going off such scarce information. No one knows what Shelley witnessed during his time in the Caucasus. No one even knew of his trip prior to his departure, but he truly believed that his calling was to visit the Armenian mountains and uncover the bygone teachings of Antiochus. After 10 years of studying abroad, Shelley finally returned to England, and with him he brought a monumental pile of writings and scriptures on Antiocheanism that would later be published as the Books of Terror and Longing. It took the scholar an extra decade to even translate the books, who was still unhappy with the final version, feeling as if it was incomplete and lacked a sense of deepest desperation. Regardless, the books were Shelley's life's work, with the scholar insisting that his sole purpose in life was to preserve Antiocheanism for the West and document as much of Antiochus's religion as humanly possible. Shelley soon sought out publishers for his books, but much to his dismay, found none. The Books of Terror and Longing were widely viewed as too dark, too obscure, and outright blasphemous. The overwhelmingly negative reception left Shelley confused and infuriated, drawing him to believe that the West had lost the feeling of religiosity entirely. With as many hardships as he faced as a result of his rejected works, at one point even being jumped by a group of malicious critics, Shelley still never abandoned his quest. The scholar soon met a wealthy young man named Dennis Carlyle, who finally became Shelley's publisher after long talks of negotiation. Carlyle ran a small publishing house named All Stars Aground, which published a number of manuscripts on obscure religions and the occult. The publisher found Shelley's personality, and especially his works, quite captivating, and he himself grew to become a very significant figure in the attempted Western revival of Antiocheanism. However, even in a collaboration with All Stars Aground, Shelley's works were still poorly received. The books only sold a handful of copies following its initial release, and even less when a more polished edition was released for the second time. Those who did get their hands on Shelley's books found his writings to be inconsistent and incoherent, going out of their way to brutally attack Shelley's credibility and denounce him as a scholar with little knowledge over his studies. With this, Shelley descended into a downward spiral of suffering. His relationship with Carlyle had since dissolved, much alike all other relationships in his life. His greatest work was rejected by the public and deemed blasphemy, and he spent his last days in an impoverished, run-down flat located east of London. Alongside Antiochus, Shelley faced insurmountable persecution and was exiled from all parts of society. His passion previously sustained him through times of difficulty, but when he even lost that, Shelley no longer saw purpose in being alive in a world that he despised. "Life has rejected me," Shelley wrote, "and I reject life." It is just as written. Antiochus would have been so proud. On Christmas night of 1902, Shelley broke into the basement of Carlyle's estate building, which was where all unsold copies of the books of Terran logging had been collecting dust. He then doused the room in kerosene, walked outside to gaze at the night sky and smoke a cigarette, and then flicked the butt onto the basement floor. While laying motionless next to all his unwanted paper, his entire life's work that ended up being utterly rejected and ignored, William Shelley, first figuratively and now literally, burned at the stake. All that was left behind with Shelley's papers was a note with a single line, of which simply read, "I would be remiss if I did not include this month's rent. And being remiss is the one thing I can no longer tolerate." As mentioned before, the Deathconsciousness booklet is a work of historical fiction. The zine is assumed to have been written entirely by frontman Dan Barrett, but much like a considerable number of first-time readers, I found that its anthropological framing and philosophies conceived by the band added so much to the storytelling's authenticity, and perhaps more importantly, aligns perfectly with Deathconsciousness as a concept album. The first-time listener is immediately greeted with Deathconsciousness's bleak cover art, a darkened, up-close version of Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Marat. This painting depicts the murder of French revolutionary leader Jean-Paul Marat, who had been stabbed in the chest by a Girondin woman named Charlotte Corday. The revolutionist lifelessly holds a note written by his murderess on his left hand and a quill on his right as he bleeds out while slumped over the edge of a bathtub, his condition capturing a somber serenity in death. It was this piece that would become one of the most iconic images to emerge from the French Revolution, maintaining a far-reaching historical influence amongst other neoclassical works. In a Reddit AMA session, Dan Barrett himself elaborated on his decision to choose The Death of Marat as the cover to Deathconsciousness, stating that he did, quote, "because I thought it looked cool, mostly. And from observing the painting's symbolism surrounding the impermanence of life, detailed in such tragic fashion, who could really blame him?" The music follows perfectly in suit with the darkness expressed on the album art, as within 13 tracks, it gradually descends into the depths of existential contemplation. To understand the true essence of human existence, one must first journey through the gaping abyss of despair. And our journey begins with a quick one before the eternal worm devours Connecticut. The 8-minute piece establishes the gloomy and ethereal soundscape of Deathconsciousness through mesmerizing drones, haunting ambience, and quiet acoustic pluckings recorded by Tim in an apartment bathtub. Notable for its intriguing title, a quick one tends to evoke feelings of dread and melancholy, as it urges the listener to reflect over every significant life decision up until this point. Drifting away to the instrumental, it almost serves as the soundtrack to a moment where you know the end result of life, that you and your world are slowly fading away. And yet, in this final moment, you choose to live in a state of tranquility and wait peacefully for the universe around you to collapse. Metaphorically speaking, this is having a quick one before the eternal worm devours Connecticut, reminiscing over the moments we've made before death inevitably takes over. If the intro lulls the listener in with somber melodies, Blood Hell utterly crushes their spirits, not only narratively, but also sonically with hard-hitting drums, a deep bassline riff, and dark electric guitar play that constantly looms in the background. The song is one of several which is thematically aligned with the Deathconsciousness booklet, predominantly focused on a scene where a figure known as the Hunter is depicted on a quest to ascend to heaven and murder God. Not only does Blood Hell directly reference quotes from Antiochus during his lecture on life after death, but it provides a psychological description on the hunter and his beliefs, who experiences feelings of indifference towards humanity and the surrounding universe. Using a staircase of bodies to climb upwards to the sky, this evocative imagery of human stepping stones being symbolic for the general meaninglessness of life. The hunter fires a flurry of arrows at God and successfully strikes him. God then plummets from the heavens to his death on earth, where thousands of animals impatiently feast on his carcass. The hunter, alongside the rest of humanity, celebrate God's sacrifice and thank him for his death while simultaneously setting the stage for a follow-up song that appears on the album after The Big Gloom. The immensely depressive third track is notably Dan Barrett's favorite he has ever created as part of Have a Nice Life, stating in an interview with Vice, "The Big Gloom is probably still the song that hits me the hardest. It was the first time we recorded with the setup we had, and we kind of recorded in a concise amount of time. I remember feeling after that song like we had really done something cool, and really used the recording setup in a cool way. That song too is very emotional lyrically, and is still my favorite on the record." The Big Gloom is widely viewed as an anthem of suicide, a musical depiction of the lowest form of depression, the bleakest points of life. In a reference to the 1990 film Jacob's Ladder, the narrator of the track is seen laying still inside an ice bath, contemplating taking their own life as their mind and body both grow increasingly numb. The speaker finds themselves bound to this deathbed, and the entire time they're there, they ponder how others in their life will perceive their death as well as how it may affect them personally. They repeatedly call out, "Please, please, please release me," taking from the anguish Antiochus expressed over the state of death and reshaping its meaning as a plea to be released from emotional validation, to be released from the need for others to understand why they're so depressed. In my eyes, the outro to this song is one of the most gut-wrenching moments in all of Deathconsciousness. As the instrumental builds up to an enormous crescendo, everything suddenly comes to a screeching halt, like the calm after a powerful storm, with nothing but the desolate echoes of a guitar being played in the background. It's here where the listener is able to truly take in what has resulted of this conceptual scene. The narrator, who lived their final moments desperate for someone to provide them reassurance, has taken their own life while laying in their frigid ice bath, even though in the end, it was never what they really wanted. Following this minor thematic detour is the continuation of Blood Hell titled Hunter. In the song, the listener follows the storyline of the hunter striking down God as it closes from the perspective of God himself. Even in his final moments, left wounded on the ground and agonizingly cannibalized by animals, God shows an emotion that the hunter has yet to display in compassion. He allows for the beast to feast on his flesh and bones and take from him what is needed, as he explains that because all life will eventually be overtaken with death, he no longer clings to his. It's this track that thoroughly emphasizes the symbolism behind the entire narrative of the hunter's quest to kill God. The hunter himself is a personification of hate, violence, and selfishness. With the hunter committing the act of murdering God, the animals down below and the rest of humanity worship him in his place, for his services were what provided them this plentiful feast, which itself could take the form of any other selfish desires we have in life. The hunter sets a precedent to take what is not theirs with violence and reject all morality in doing so, and humanity, who had never been violent prior to this moment, blindly follow suit and live their lives as self-seeking mortals. Telephony establishes a grim sci-fi environment where the speaker is depicted building a telephone system that can travel through time and contact a loved one from the past who is now deceased. Given the personal context surrounding the life of frontman Dan Barrett, one could infer that the song was written in remembrance of his late father, who he wishes he could speak to one final time, even if he understands that it would be best to simply move forward in life. The narrator of the track develops a hatred for time because of this implied death, violently illustrating their desires to snap time in half and break its back with their machine so they can physically bring back the loved one which time has taken from them. also providing commentary on the selfishness of humanity. Telephony ultimately showcases how dwelling over the past can have detrimental consequences to the psyche through heartbreaking storytelling. Track 6 on Deathconsciousness is Who Would Leave Their Son Out in the Sun, a piece reminiscent of the harrowing acoustic instrumentation and songwriting present on Dan Barrett's future projects as Giles Corey, and one which features many significant religious references. The song uses biblical imagery to depict an existential crisis suffered by the narrator, who describes a profound apathy in life that not even the power of the divine could extinguish. One particular line further highlights the track's undertones of hopelessness, relating such feelings towards life to something as pointless as pushing against a brick wall. This itself is a pessimistic counter-approach of a passage from Notes from the Underground by the 19th century Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. Whereas the protagonist of this story faces such an obstacle with resilience, our narrator faces it with stubbornness and doubt. All throughout the song, and especially its latter half, the narrator calls out to God and questions why he has put his creation through so much torment. With the title of Who Would Leave Their Son Out in the Sun using the reference of Jesus suffering on the cross in broad daylight as an allusion to this. Trapped in insurmountable existential agony, the narrator concludes the track by simply stating, "Everyone spends some time on the cross. I just want to make sure it's not a total loss," hoping that there may be some worth or reward in living a life shrouded in dread. The 7th track is yet another instrumental piece entitled There Is No Food, set in an atom-blasted moonscape as stated by Dan Barrett. Beaming sounds are continuously echoed over the song's cold ambience, which creates an atmosphere akin to that of floating aimlessly on a spaceship while entirely isolated within the cosmos. An electric guitar momentarily graces the instrumental, before it then grows harsher in noise, with riveting bass and anguished yells and screams, which partially come from Tim passionately reciting a poem while layered over vast distortion. As hinted by its title, the track serves as a ghastly depiction of starving to death, a person without food or others around them hopelessly withering away. With the conclusion of There Is No Food, the listener now embarks on the second of 2 discs Deathconsciousness is divided by, being The Plow That Broke the Plains and The Future. The titles of these sections have meanings both on their own and when put together that ultimately tie into the themes expressed on the album. The Plow That Broke the Plains is symbolic of the hunter's storyline. Taking on the role of the plow, he destroys all that is sound and breaks any peace or harmony in the world as he becomes humanity's tormented deity. The Future explores the consequences of this in The Future, and details how even in the present day, we're still able to observe the loss of nature's purity and the presence of negation in all living things, just as they were foretold by historical figures of the ancient past. A testament to how timeless these teachings truly are. The Future opens with the highly energetic Waiting for Black Metal Records to Come in the Mail. Sonically, the song is notable for being a standout showcase of Have a Nice Life's signature post-punk sound, and can even be viewed as a return to form for the duo, with its fast-paced tempo matching that of works by In Pieces, and grisly instrumentation being reminiscent of the black metal influenced band Danger Strangers. Corporate corruption and intolerance towards death and exploitation are 2 prominent themes of this track, as Dan sings of how powerful institutions trick the populace into being covered in dark palls. These sheets, otherwise used to cover coffins, blinding society to the heinous acts committed by the powers that be. Some of these acts are further elaborated upon, including increased pollution, government corruption, and genocide. The track's narrator criticizes humanity's descent into a dystopian society controlled entirely by megacorporations who maximize profit out of death, expressing a burning frustration towards the reality of our world, while simultaneously recognizing that very little can be done to combat this oppression. In turn, this leads one to lack a strong emotional reaction to the world being destroyed around them, calling back to themes of apathy previously displayed on Blood Hill, as they recognize the unavoidable presence of greed in society. Through an immense composition, Holy Fucking Shit 40,000 thoroughly portrays determinism, which is the philosophical viewpoint that every event in the universe is predetermined by a variety of external factors, making free will non-existent. The song introduces this topic as bluntly as possible through its opening lyrics. Everything you do is planned out in advance, and the stars push their dark wills down on you. reducing human behavior to something as predictable as machinery in the lines following. Much of this track uses advanced artificial intelligence to illustrate a person who has lost all human emotion. These machines are perfectly constructed, and in this case, programmed to complete the task of murder with excellent efficiency. But while they're built with maximum capabilities, they largely lack any genuine feelings, and in this sense, exist with a void unable to be filled. This emptiness of the soul plays a part in the song's title, which is notorious amongst Have a Nice Life fans for its double entendre meaning. 40,000 was roughly the average suicide rate in America in the 2000s. Obviously a horrible number to fathom, and yet one that rarely evokes a genuine emotional reaction out of most people. A person may hear this statistic and feel saddened by it, but they subsequently move on with their lives and disregard its implications of our environment. 40,000 is also more clearly a reference to the wargame of Warhammer 40,000, set in a period of the 41st millennium where factions of war machines fight in never-ending battles. But of course, they are all ultimately pawns to the player. Every function and action these war machines engage in has already been programmed by the creators who hold power over them, lining up with the deterministic belief that everything we do as humans has already been decided for us. A number of lines also reference the 1984 classic film The Terminator, which sees a robot assassin traveling back in time to murder the mother of the future leader of the human resistance, Sarah Connor, building a parallel between a compliant machine accepting a violent mission and humanity in their lack of free will. The Future is the album's third instrumental cut, featuring roaring guitar feedback that is accompanied with loud drums. As an interlude, The Future is empty, riddled with mechanical noises, and without any distinct direction, because this is our future. Deep, Deep looks back on humanity's relationship with God, with the narrator posing a question to Christ himself on why the love they have shown towards him has only been met in return with overwhelming feelings of loneliness and depression. Like all of Deathconsciousness, a bleak outlook on life, and biological procreation in particular, is held within the song's verses, noting its inevitable path into even more death and destruction than the world has already seen. This itself adds on to the philosophy behind determinism, while also highlighting the infinite cycle of death and rebirth. The narrator feels guilty about not having any power to create a better outcome for themselves than the disheartening reality they face, and asks the question, how do we reconcile our deaths? We'd better figure it out before long. Here, the general concept of Deathconsciousness is at its most direct, as the lines force the listener to ponder over the fact that everything in the universe is slowly fading away, begging the question of how one could possibly fathom the idea of death happening at every moment, occurring all around you. Deathconsciousness's penultimate track is widely viewed by many as one of Have a Nice Life's most utterly soul-crushing, this being I Don't Love. Nearing the end of their painful and agonizing journey, our narrator pleads to God for their life to be over, these suicidal cries drowned in an encompassing soundscape of equally sorrowful distortion and industrial instrumentation. Such intense levels of suffering are displayed front and center through this track's songwriting, which describes them being psychologically numb, to the point where one can neither show love, nor find it in them to receive it, or any other emotion for that matter. They feel that they should be happier, that they should have more love in their hearts, and be able to feel love, but is completely void of any in actuality, causing the narrator to view themselves as worthless and strengthen their urge to end their life. A strong desire to escape from the miserable experience that is living is expressed, but the narrator concurrently acknowledges that in exiting this life of torment, there will be nothing left for them at all when they die. Yes, they will leave behind the pain, heartbreak, and a lingering existential dread, but they will be unable to take anything else with them in death. Have a Nice Life says so much on anhedonia, and the ideation of suicide that comes along with it with so little, and it's what makes this piece such an emotionally heavy listen for many fans. And finally, there is Earthmover. The 11-minute closing track to Deathconsciousness tells a sci-fi story of all-powerful golems, gargantuan beings carved out of stone and earth who are immortal to time. These golems are awoken with a sensation of rage, their long-dormant urge to cause catastrophe having finally been revived. Over pounding drums and a sensational shift in volume from soft to uproarious, the beings are depicted destroying large mountains as they bring forth the apocalypse unto the earth. The golems continue roaming around the world as they leave behind them a path of devastation, but as more time passes and the golems grow restless, they slowly become conscious of their tragic existence. Forged without any purpose aside from destruction, the golems have no genuine reason behind their being. Although they're immortal, monumental in size, and able to demolish anything in sight, the golems live without the ability to create and without the ability to rest or even die. They grow tired of causing so much carnage, and in turn, tired of existing. But the golems know that they will never, in their eternity of living, be able to distance themselves from their programming, and it leads them to feel apathetic towards all of the destruction they inflict. An army of the golems is stalking now the Heart's lands, eating all reality. Producing only dust and sand, nothing hurts them, nothing gets under their stone skin. And when their earthen mouths will open up, and just what words will come out, but we wish we were dead. The golems cannot speak and cannot create. They cannot feel hurt, happy, nor sad, because all that they can do is bring forth negation. Even when the entire world is destroyed and there is nothing left to negate, the golems will still be wandering, forever yearning for an end to their pointless suffering. In a fantasy where they can speak, the first words that the golems would ever utter would be exclamations of death, begging for eternal rest instead of eternal annihilation. A particular series of ear-piercing notes are played in Earthmover's final minutes, which came as a result of Tim himself slamming down his bass guitar during the song's recording, a heavily emotional moment he further comments on in an interview with Vice. Dan does tell the story. Fans will always ask about how he got that bass drop at the end of the song. Quite literally, I threw the bass guitar down and stalked out of the room. Recording that particular track, it was a lot of songs we built from the bass up. That one, instrumentally, ended up being particularly backwards, and we were doing bass last. I physically acted out and ended up in the recording. It was a bit too much to take to keep going with it at a certain point. I guess that's a real in-the-moment example. As I revisited Earthmover for this video, one particular set of lines stood out to me more than before, like spikes upon a crown we wear upon our brow. I couldn't help but notice how full circle these lyrics are for the entire grandiose storyline behind Deathconsciousness. Of course, in the track's context, we refers to the immortal golems living in pain, but the we being described wearing the crown of thorns can also represent a more universal suffering, a state of existential dread felt across all beings, communities, and generations of history. We includes the earth-destroying golems, and also includes the heartless machines, the apathetic hunter, the neglected William Shelley, the mystifying Antiochus, God himself, and all who live now, in the present moment. And what is it that all of these figures, spanning centuries of history beginning in the ancient past to the technologically advanced future, collectively share? Deathconsciousness's final line: we wish we were dead. In the decade following the release of Deathconsciousness on January 24th, 2008, the album went from remaining largely obscure to witnessing an unprecedented surge in popularity, which has led to Have a Nice Life gradually developing a cult audience. The project became a prominent talking point within online music communities such as 4chan's Music Board, Rate Your Music, and r/indie heads on Reddit, and has since been deemed an essential album by fans and music critics alike. The impact of Deathconsciousness and its themes is undoubtedly still prevalent today, its influences expanding through natural word of mouth, not only onto music enthusiasts, but also onto other musicians across a wide range of genres and styles. So many modern bands in the shoegaze and post-rock spheres echo the emotional depth and despairing soundscape present on Deathconsciousness, and its legacy of sonic dread is still appreciated by those outside of these genres as well. Take the popular rapper Lil Peep, sampling a quick one before the Eternal Worm Devours Connecticut on one of his songs as a model example. It truly is fascinating to see this project receive so much recognition both in and outside of online spaces, and I believe a vital reason why so many people now admire the music, concept, and messages of Deathconsciousness is because of how it requires the listener to fully embrace its sentiments and lean into the established universe. Death consciousness candidly embodies the concept of nihilism, further forwarding the idea that all of existence is without any substance and that free will is a myth developed by society with impossible hopes of transcending death. The philosophies behind the storytelling, coupled with their delivery through brooding ambience, vocals shrouded in a fog of distortion, and instrumentation which so exquisitely captures feelings of existential angst, guides the curious listener in unveiling a larger truth, which is not only expressed in the listening experience, but also in the obscure stories of Antiocheanism, and in the broader sense of Deathconsciousness's somber nature. Simply put, this truth is that nothing is immortal. We can live our entire lives building lasting relationships, accomplishing significant achievements, or constructing remarkable monuments that will press on beyond our own existence. But it is still crucial to remember that no matter how long it lasts, everything in the universe all goes away, and that living oblivious to this certainty and denying the presence of death in the grand scheme of history only dooms you for more misery. Now, as we've so clearly seen, it is very easy to spend a lifetime constantly dwelling over nihilistic principles and struggling to find value in our existence when it seems like there is none. But it is worth noting that while Death Consciousness does teach us that death is happening at every moment and is present in all forms of creation, at its core, the album simultaneously showcases humanity's undying spirit. Nihilism itself implies a longing for something more of life, a refusal to believe that our existence is without any significant purpose. It is contradictory, but then again, many philosophers have never embraced nihilism as a lifestyle so much as they have viewed it as a challenge meant to be overcome. Look no further for such perseverance than in that of Dan Barrett himself, who has reflected on his life in the years following the release of Death Consciousness in an interview, while highlighting just how much his mentality has changed since then. I will say that my feelings on it have changed since I had kids. My youngest is 7 and my oldest son will be 9 this summer. At this point in my life, I kind of view it as I'm just further along than them. And I don't mean I'm more successful, I mean that I'm further down the timeline. Now it's later and things are very different. I have very different coping mechanisms. I have a very different skill set in terms of managing my emotions, managing the world around me, and managing my environment. Because of all these little changes over time, I am in a vastly different place than I could have possibly imagined. If you asked me 20 years ago what the future would be like, today would have not been a possible outcome in my head. Many fans have not only found solace in Have a Nice Life's music, but also in their personal growth as individuals and how they themselves have managed to overcome such bleak periods of depression and anhedonia. Ultimately, none of this is implied narratively, but it does go to show that life still finds ways to prevail through negation. With as many sacrifices as we've made and deaths we've seen, humans continue to propel society forward and lay the foundation for generations to come. Yes, we must all die one day, but that shouldn't derail us from building human connections, celebrating our victories, and perhaps most importantly, cherishing our individuality. Every star in the universe will inevitably supernova, but they all still burn passionately during their billions of years of existence. And once these stars do explode, it is always viewed as a monumental cosmic event because of how brightly they shine in the sky and how colossal the blast is. It is billions of years, culminating into one beautiful release. Death Consciousness shows us that all living beings will be met with death, but also that this eternal fact does not impede the primal ability to simply be, to create, love, feel, and find meaning in the meaningless. And to me, that's the point.